Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us. It looks like we've still got people joining us and kind of rolling in, but we will go ahead and get started. Just to start us off with a couple notes here today. My name is Chesney Sallee from the NAI National Office, and the way that we'll host this Q&A today is that we'll rely on a panelist of individuals who've been on this study group about regular season formats to help lead us through on some of the questions that have already been provided to us that we've been collecting over the last couple of weeks, and then also have an opportunity for you to ask questions as we go as well. So to get us started here, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We've had a group of, originally I believe it was 10 athletics directors and conference commissioners who've really been doing the heavy lifting of this study. A few of those individuals have left their institutions or conferences since we began. We have 5 of our athletics directors and 3 of our conference commissioners who are really continuing to carry this study through here as we go today. So Matt Beaudry, Reagan Rossi, Ashley Walyuchow, Drew Watson, Darin Wilson, Mike Daniels, Eric Ward, and Corey Westra have really been leading us through here and deserve a lot of credit for the work that we have done thus far, and we'll be responding to several of your questions as we go here today. One key thing that I would like to note is that this study is really an ongoing study that just happens to be occurring now in this weird time of COVID that we find ourselves all in. A lot of the questions that we received seemed a little unsure of if this was a response to COVID or if this was really applicable just for this COVID year that we are all in. And the actual situation of this study is that this started back in 2019 and came out of some concerns and direction from our Council of Presidents, as well as then a follow-up survey that we did with our membership. So of presidents, athletics directors, faculty athletic representatives, and coaches. We then later did a survey of student athletes as well. So all of that information was help informing us and telling us that we really needed to focus on the way that we look at our regular season formats and structure and what that experience then is for our campuses and our student athletes. So anything that we're talking about here today was ongoing study work and would not come into play or apply during what we hope is this one COVID year. Anything that we're talking about here and that may ultimately come to fruition wouldn't apply for quite a while down the road. So hopefully at the time at which we've come to otherwise return to normal, we're talking about kind of that normal structure of regular season formats, but adjustments that may be appropriate and were potentially appropriate pre-pandemic. So coming out of the survey, what we heard were a few primary concerns. So focusing on things like missed class time and academic performance, the experience overall for our student athletes and their wellness, both physical and mental. And then from an operational or a logistical standpoint, the costs that our campuses are bearing and what our support staff, so folks like athletic trainers, sports information directors, your administrators, and eligibility and compliance folks, kind of what this current structure then means for them. We also heard a few other key items related to the housing burden, specifically in the fall, that we see with student athletes and the timing at which they're coming back to campus, and that some of our sports probably deserve some further review and there may be some appropriate adjustments, but that isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. You'll note that this is a high-level kind of overview of some of that feedback that we received. There is more information and we'll direct you on where you can find that if you're not yet familiar. So based off of all of the feedback and initial conversations that led to this in 2019, the study group has been relying on a handful of guiding principles. So you can see them kind of highlighted on your screen today. But as we continued to have challenging conversations, these were those topics or principles that we anchored ourselves back towards. As you might imagine, at times or on particular conversations, these may be in conflict. So something that may, an option that may reduce operational costs could impact the student athlete experience in a way that may or may not be appropriate. So there were definitely some hard conversations to be had by the study group and leading to some of their initial recommendations. But these were those 5 key topics or guiding principles that we continue to orient ourselves around. I'll also note that you'll hear me today referencing the study group of athletics directors and commissioners. But in addition to that, we have engaged with quite a few other groups, including our Council for Student Athletes and our Council of Faculty Athletics Representatives, to help check our thinking as we go and enter into the conversation to ensure that we were incorporating those additional perspectives. So like I mentioned just a moment ago, we're not going to spend time today going through all of the various study and all of the background that got us to where we are today, because we want to make sure that we prioritize time for the questions that folks are having. But for anybody who's not familiar or hasn't had a chance yet, please go to our webpage that is designed just for this study and this topic, and you'll be able to look around at the data that we relied on, survey results. You can look at the specific surveys that we got from student athletes on a sport by sport basis and how they would respond to particular questions about time demands or their hopes or expectations and those sorts of things. So I want to make sure everybody is aware that there's a lot more information beyond what we're going to talk about here today that is shared on that page. So as we get started here, one last thing before we get into our questions, we had requested questions in advance of today, and so we've received those, and we'll start to work our way through those here in just a moment. But in addition, if you have questions as we go for any of the panelists, either about things that we've referenced or things that you'd like to hear us reference, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll kind of adopt those in as we work our way through here. So to start with, I'll go to my list of questions here. So some folks were asking, the recommendations that you can see on that webpage there, they don't necessarily incorporate all NAIA sports, but someone was asking, can you tell us a little bit specifically why some of the sports like tennis or golf weren't included here? So I may look to you, Darin and Reagan, to help us with those, as those are both spring sports. And one other thing I should note for everybody is that study group of the 10 athletics directors and commissioners, we also sort of subdivided ourselves by season, recognizing that there are some challenges that the fall sports may face that spring sports don't, or vice versa. So Darin and Reagan, I'll look to you to talk us through why some of those additional spring sports weren't incorporated.
Well, we really looked early on, as you know, across the board, and with us being in the spring, we looked at what sports kind of rose to the top that seemed to be those bubble over sports, if you will, that we hear year after year after year that seem to have issues. And as we've looked across the NAIA landscape, really there wasn't a lot of concern that we had seen at this point with the others other than baseball and softball. We also thought lacrosse being new was one of the reasons. And then, none of us seem to have really that issue with tennis. Even the teams that are playing the maximum now tennis contest, just it's a difference in missed class time, so on and so forth. So I'll let Regan kind of chime in there, or Corey, either one.
Yeah, Darin, I think you're right. And with golf being spread over, the ability to spread over 2 seasons, I think it's important to note, as we're talking, what the original name of this committee is schedule creep, and which ones are actually creeping over and really causing the angst with all the different constituents across campus. And like you said, tennis and golf don't seem to rise to that occasion.
Another good point, because there's several tennis programs that are playing in the fall as well. And so we've tried, and I know we're gonna talk about this later, but we really tried to stay away from the fall as far as our spring sports go. And we really looked at that, spring start date. And if institutions and particular teams were competing or playing in the fall, we didn't want to touch that.
Right.
So a little bit more of a kind of general or overarching question that somebody, I think, accurately or astutely identified is there's some conflicts between these overarching regulations. And by overarching, I think we're talking about regulations that would apply to all 250 institutions, or even within a given sport, all 250 teams of that particular sport across the NAIA. Why is that necessary, as opposed to an approach that would rely more on institutional autonomy? So certainly institutional autonomy being kind of a hallmark of the NAIA, as this person noted. Why did the study group suggest more regulation rather than more deference to each campus? And Eric and Drew, I may turn to you two on that for this round of questions.
Yeah, I think, Chesney, anytime we talk about, as an organization, we talk about making changes or leaving those changes up to individual institutions to monitor and to regulate, there's always a certain amount of peer pressure that creeps in. And it's very difficult, to create an environment with our coaches where they feel like there's a level playing field. Other people have an opportunity to say start, earlier or play earlier. There's always that conversation that takes place. So I think sometimes these changes that I think everyone from an administrative standpoint would agree that we need to think about and make. When it gets to that point where we're actually having those conversations with coaches, it becomes very difficult because of the competitive balance conversation. And that's why I think it's better for us to look at making these kinds of changes uniformly across the membership, because then that maintains that competitive balance that coaches are looking for all the time.
Well, and I would add that there's sometimes when we legislate because there's a small problem in the sector of the association, and instead of addressing it, specifically, we create a bylaw. That's really not the case in this situation. We've seen, and I don't know if you have it, Chesney, but the amount of contests that were happening on multiple 3, 4, 5 contests on various campuses at the same time is really an association-wide problem. And so as we start on our study, that was really something that personally hit me. And Chesney's got it up now. But number of games on a single day, you see this here, 6 games, 303 times an institution had 6 games on a single day, 495 times 5 games, and 21, almost 2,200 times that institutions had 4 games. And many of those situations are happening in the fall winter transition and the winter spring transition. And so I think it's incumbent that we look at situations that we can really take a lot of pressure off our staff and move forward in a positive way.
Since we had that chart up, I'll just add a little bit more context to that chart. We relied on information coming out of DAC stats as an example of a place that houses statistics around many of our sports, but not all across the NAI. So there may even have been more instances of additional competitions beyond what you saw there, looking just at a 1 year as an example. And at the high end, we got to situations where dozens of instances of schools having 7 or 8 games on a particular day and having to figure out how to host and operate and manage all of those types of events. And by the time we got to, like you see there, 4 games on a single day, over 2,000 of those instances. So obviously extremely common across our association. So as you might imagine, we got a lot of questions from coaches across the association asking particular questions about why was this exactly recommended within my particular sport, or did you consider X, Y, or Z? Mike, I might look to you to answer this one, but can you talk a little bit about how we engaged coaches groups within this process and coming to these recommendations?
Sure. Yeah, I think it was important for this group to reach out to the executive committees and everybody. We split up the executive committees who they were, because as a coaches group, you are selecting those individuals to represent you on a whole. And so for us, and we've been criticized as an association in the past of not doing that, of not reaching out to coaches groups and not getting input. So we thought that was really important to do this time. And I think we've reached out to every one of them and had a conversation and gotten that feedback from them. They're not going to agree with all the recommendations, obviously, but I think that at least get some input to take back to the committee and say, hey, did we think about this? Did we look at this instance? And that was important for us.
And one thing that I'll note there is somebody else was asking, when would all of this go into effect potentially? And at this point, from a process standpoint, What we're talking about here with things like potential game reductions or start dates or those sorts of things would require NAI legislation or a bylaw change. So we could be on pace to potentially submit any of those types of proposals. Those proposals are now due the very end of February. So potentially submit any of those sorts of proposals and evaluate them at the NAI convention and business meeting, which will happen in May, but they wouldn't go into effect until the fall of 2022. So recognizing any decisions that could be made in May would not have time to go into effect or schedules adjusted or any of those sorts of things for this coming academic year. So everyone would have a full year of lead time or notice for any such changes. So here's a question for any of our panelists, but we've got some questions about, student athletes from their survey responses. A key response seems to be kind of honing in on these competing time demands, whether it's from they feel like they have time demands from their athletic side or the academic side of their life, or employment. They may be students who are working jobs, or just anything else in their personal life, and how they are trying to balance all of those competing time demands. So one of the questions was surrounding, did we think about some sort of limitation around the amount of practice or competition, knowing that in the past we've at least discussed as an association, should we have a mandatory day off, or should there be a set number of practice hours or contact hours per week or something along those lines? So did the study group consider anything along those lines during its review?
Short answer is yes. And I think that was a cognitive component, at least in our discussions in the fall group. And I think when we got together, that was always at the back of everybody's mind when we looked at this. So, yeah, I mean, and knowing that the student athletes have asked for that day off in the past, and that we got to the compromise of a resolution rather than a bylaw. Yeah, it was a strong consideration throughout all the conversations.
And I think we were really cognizant of trying to balance NAI legislation and NAI overreach with campus autonomy. And I think this is one of those areas where, as we knew with the CSA from a few years back, where they had came with this potential day off legislation, I think we knew as a committee that this is one of those areas that we can go back and rely on our institutions with our athletics directors or our conferences and our conference commissioners to have those own recommendations or those own policies set forth on their own campus. And so, yes, we considered it, but I think it was important for us to be aware of the campus autonomy as well.
I think it's important to note too that what we heard from student athletes differed a lot of times of what we hear from coaches and how they represent their student athletes. Coaches across the board in our study said more games, more games, more games, more practice, more practice. That's what our kids want. Don't take anything away from them. This is hurting the student athletes. I hear that in my own conference in the Golden State Athletic Conference as well. But I've also talked to my student athlete advisory committee. I've got an intern in the office right now that's a current student athlete. And so we took it to them, and they're trying to find that balance. Yes, they do want to play games. They'd rather play games than practice, that's for sure. But they're trying to find that balance, and that's not necessarily jiving with what coaches are telling us. And we struggle with that in the GSAC on an annual basis. And we've found that with this committee and talking with the different coaches groups, it's that same trying to find, okay, where is the truth? Where does it lie? Do we need to cut some of those games to help some of the student athletes because it's too much? Or is it, yes, they just want to keep playing. They want to keep playing, as we're hearing from the coaches. So, but I think it's important. And for those coaches that are on here, we have tried to look at both sides of this equation.
One of the things we looked at, Mike, Matt, and I were on the winter sports oversight of this process, and we've got basketball coaches around the country who, first week back in August, are having their kids in captains open gyms, and so I would distinguish a mandatory day off as a little bit different in that you're getting you're getting a day off a week, but we're looking at the scope of the whole year. When we've got coaches bringing back kids and having them start activity immediately upon putting their getting to campus, and that really goes against the idea that of the 24-week situation and just making sure that student athletes can be well-rounded citizens on campus, have the jobs they need, establish themselves academically. And I think what we've looked at accomplishes that.
Drew, as a follow-up to that, you mentioned the 24-week season, and that's something that I think before we ever got into any of the specifics of the study, and when, like to Reagan's point, we, amongst the commissioners and ADA leadership, kind of referenced this idea that schedules are creeping, and what might we do to keep that in bounds. And I think one of the thought processes was that maybe 24 weeks isn't the right amount of time. Maybe that needs to be changed or differ somewhat, but that's not currently in any of the study groups' recommendations. So can you talk a little bit about what that conversation has been thus far?
Yeah, I think when you get into the topic that we've tried to tackle over the last year and a half, it starts to have various tentacles. And one of the tentacles is the 24-week rule. And I think we found ourselves, starting to dive into that. We always came back to, hey, that's not the purpose of this study and this task force. Let's see if these changes can affect any positive change. I think that we had some very, vigorous debate on the 24-week rule, and I think there's some a wide range of thoughts on that. But we always came back to, hey, let's leave that be, and see if this has any positive effect, and maybe address that later. And I think, and I will add, on the other side of it, I know there's some coaches groups and some conferences who are contemplating legislative proposals that would expand the 24 weeks. And so, as we were faced with some of those questions, we decided that we would ask those conferences to kind of pump the brakes on those proposals and just allow us to work here and see if this has any positive effect, and move forward after we see this and how it possibly affects things.
Chesney, in my time, in the NAI, we've tackled some fairly challenging subjects. This probably is one of the most challenging, just because there's so much pressure coming from so many different directions. We've got, pressure from a recruiting standpoint and enrollment standpoint to be competitive and to be able to, tout our advantages over NCAA Division II, Division III institutions. We've got presidents who want financial relief because they're spending more and more money on athletics, or their budgets are shrinking and they can't afford to spend what they've been spending on athletics. So they're looking for some budgetary relief. We've got members of our athletic department staff just getting beaten up during certain times of the year, and the burnout rate is extremely high for athletic trainers and sports information directors who are just getting pummeled during certain months of the year in the fall and the spring because of the overlapping of the seasons. And we've got strain on facilities. We've got facilities that are being overused, and so there's pressure from so many different sides. I think what our goal was just to try to find that very narrow path to walk between all those things that might help relieve some of the pressure, but not overly legislate so that we put ourselves at a disadvantage when it came to recruiting and enrollment.
And Chesney, as Eric gives the full look and the complexities of the study, I would just share what's outlined on the webpage is the close look at NCAA Division II and NCAA Division III to help position us, the research, the recommendations, etc. So where possible, we tried to be strategic in placing the NAI in a position for success, as possible with certain sports. So that was a big focus of the committee, and I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and well said by both of you. And someone had asked a question of why do we primarily focus on Division II and Division III, but not take a look more so at Division I's, NCAA Division I's structure? And that's something that I think they were referencing it specifically from a game standpoint. And we can certainly take a look at that moving forward in a greater degree than we have thus far. But the primary reason we haven't to date was kind of what Matt and Eric were just alluding to, which is as we think about things like recruiting and that sort of thing, Division II and Division III are more so those institutions and those teams that we see our coaches in conflict with as it relates to recruiting. So comparing ourselves is important to at least know from those divisions especially, but we can certainly incorporate that moving forward. I'm going to transition us a little bit to start to talk specifically about specific seasons and sports and some of those recommendations. So I'm going to start with the fall group. So Eric, this first question may be for you, but can you talk a little bit about how the various fall start dates were established and why start dates in fall? We see that from the recommendations coming from the study group, we see a recommended start date for many of our fall sports, which is not something that in any large degree we've had to date. To date, it has been basically anything that you'd like to do in terms of practice or competition is permissible after August 1. So can you talk a little bit about the adjustment there from the study group?
Sure. I think early on, our part of the task force that was looking at fall sports, we realized that there wasn't a lot that we were going to be able to do on the back end of the fall season because those dates and that schedule pretty much aligns with the national championship calendar. So really we started and maintained our focus on the beginning of the fall practice and competitive season, primarily from the standpoint of helping with some cost savings for our institutions. I can speak from personal experience as a very large football conference. I have institutions that are all over the board as far as how they handle that lodging, that housing and meal situation for the student athletes that come in prior to the start of classes. But on an extreme situation, I've got one school that basically has to write a check back to the institution for about $75,000 when they bring their football team in, the 1st of August, and then they have to house them and feed them for that period of time up until the cafeteria officially opens and students, the rest of the students return to campus and classes begin. So, that's a significant expense. And in some situations, that's completely thrown back on the athletic department to have to figure out where that's going to come from. But the bottom line is typically it's an expense. It's an expense to the bottom line of the institution, whether the institution covers it or whether the athletic department covers it. So we focused on that period of time on the start of preseason practice until the date of first competition. And for the most part, we didn't really change a lot of contest limits or didn't recommend many changes to contest limits with fall sports. We instead focused on that preseason period and the actual start of competition.
So this could be a question for you, Eric and Mike. I know you talked with some of the soccer coaches leadership. So expand that a little bit to talk specifically about soccer as it relates to start dates, because soccer is a sport, excuse me, where we the study group is not recommending a game reduction at this point. So we have some soccer coaches who are saying that may make it a challenge for us as soccer coaches or for our teams to get to kind of play up to our full number of games still, but in a more condensed time frame. So can you talk a little bit about what that thought process has been thus far?
Yeah, men's soccer in particular is a little bit different than women's soccer, and I know Eric is on the fall. But I'll address the men's part first, and then maybe go to Ash or Eric for the women's side. Men's soccer at the Division I level is doing a study, and they've got a huge study, and NCAA was actually going to vote on it until COVID hit about moving their season for the entire year. And having some games in the fall and then going into the spring, and their spring would be when the championship would be. And so the men's soccer coaches in particular had a lot of questions about that. Did we look at that? Some of our committee knew about it, some of them did not. But we have looked at that. I think men's soccer is a little bit, what do we do? Because if that does happen at the NCAA Division I level, how will it affect NAIA? How will that affect Division II? In particular with the number of games, which is your question. I want to kind of set that up in the men's soccer because that's out there still. And again, our committee is trying to address what we do moving forward. But with the number of games, we didn't really want to reduce the number of games because we didn't think we thought that was a non-starter for men's soccer. But that does conflict with shortening the time frame of when they can start. The challenge is that some of those schools are starting games in the second week of August, and they're just bringing kids back August 1. So there's not a real vast preseason for them. It's not happening all over the country, but it is happening in some parts of the country where games are starting that second week in August, which is really conflicting of what we're trying to do with what Eric just addressed of the costs bringing those kids in 2 weeks prior to when school is going to start. That costs the institution money. Well, the argument on the other side is, yes, but we can get games in before classes start, so we're reducing missed class time. There is that balance. Well, which direction do you go? So again, I'll toss it back to Ash and Eric for the women's soccer, but that was addressed by the men's soccer committee for sure, and we've talked about it as a committee.
Similar concerns when I talked with the women's soccer executive. Outside of that year-round competition, because it really hadn't been floated on that side, there was some worry about the start date being pushed back and the compression of 18 games. But I think there is some room for some compromise and maybe adjusting that. And we were aware of that when the recommendations were made, but sometimes, if you don't make a recommendation or a decision, you're not accomplishing anything either. And so, but I think there's some opportunity, and Eric and I visited that, there might be an opportunity to move that start date a little bit to allow a little bit more flexibility, less schedule compression, and still maybe accommodate what we're trying to do.
I think this is a great example because Ashley and I did have a conversation earlier today in trying to find some compromise in our recommendations, because our original recommendation for volleyball and soccer, I think, Ashley, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was like the first Thursday or the Thursday before Labor Day or the first Thursday in September, something like that. I know it was a Thursday.
Thursday prior to Labor Day, I believe. Yeah.
And so, with the feedback we got from, and this is why it was important for us to reach out to these coaches executive committees, is to get this kind of feedback. But I think based on the feedback we got from both volleyball and soccer, there probably is room for some compromise there, where maybe we push that start date up a week, to the last Thursday in August instead of September. So that that extra week might help decompress that schedule a little bit. But I think there is still a need for consideration, because we did see some creep. I mean, when we looked at the numbers, we're seeing consistent and gradual creep. And when soccer matches and volleyball matches are getting played in August, and we're getting closer and closer to August 15 for a normal first date of competition scenario for those two sports, as we probably were 5 to 10 years ago. And so that's the concern with trying to kind of normalize the start date for those sports, so that we can give institutions some financial relief and when they're bringing their athletes in.
And that may be a good segue. Someone was asking a question related to soccer is a good example, but we see this in a few other sports where our rules currently allow for specific sort of off-season, I'll say it loosely that way, off-season scrimmages in those sports. So soccer, as an example, has 3 scrimmages or scrimmage dates that can only be used in the spring. So has that been talked about, or has that been feedback from our coaches groups at all in some of these sports, thinking that what part of what that does is also continues kind of this creep across multiple academic terms for sports that otherwise the heart of your competition is primarily in one academic term.
Guilty. We're guilty. We're guilty of having done that. And I think that's what happens when you look at those types of proposals, requests from coaches groups through a monocle, as opposed, to that, 360-degree view. And I think when we've made those decisions, it's, we've been focused completely on that sport, and at times been worn down by coaches associations that have every year have asked for more, and then we look for a bone to throw them. And so, I would basically say that, what we've done now with this particular group is tried to take a step back so we can look at everything from that, with that 360-degree view to see what we need to do going forward. I think if that kind of proposal came forward now with the work that we've done, I think we would probably feel differently about approving that at this point. I think we approved that at a moment of weakness, obviously. And so, I think that's the value in this process that we've gone through.
Yeah, and I'll add, even on the men's soccer side, as probably most of you know, the GSAC hosts the national championship, so we're really close to it. And the study by the NCAA and how that's going to affect the NAIA has some merit. It has some merit from the men's soccer, and Eric and I disagree on this for sure, because Eric is going to say, not going to put words in your mouth, but I am, why are we moving another sport to the spring? Like, we've got so many sports in the spring already. Why would we do that? And that's not part of that recommendation for this study, but it is out there that it could affect us down the line. So we could be making this change in men's soccer, and then a year from now, we're addressing, do we make men's soccer a spring sport? And they carry over. They talked about those scrimmages, and that's how this relates, is that we have some scrimmages in the spring already. So why couldn't we play games and make them countable games in the spring and move those scrimmages to the fall? That is out there. But then, okay, how do we find that balance again? We're going to add another sport to the spring. That's a tough one. But from a health and safety standpoint, it makes a ton of sense in the sport of men's soccer. And you see it at all levels. You see it from Premier League and MLS and how many games they're playing. And why don't we want to do that same thing from a health and safety standpoint? So again, just trying to express the dilemma that we face on some of these issues.
And Mike, I think you just essentially touched on there something that was coming up, or that we've received a couple of questions on related to a variety of sports, which is the idea that providing more space in terms of competition or number of games, the decreased frequency of play in between competitions can be better for student athletes in a whole variety of ways. But you just referenced the challenge with doing so, and that kind of puts us in, all of our sports start to get more into this year-round model, and all of our championships push further back and back. So obviously it's a balance as part of that conversation, but I know a lot of people are asking related questions for a variety of our sports. Eric, I know you were going to chime in.
I was going to say Mike's right. He and I would probably be on different sides of that conversation for different reasons. And my comments and my feelings about that would basically mirror my member institutions and their concerns. So, one of the other challenges that we haven't really talked about is the fact that, we have a pretty diverse membership as far as how different institutions use athletics within their campuses. Some rely more heavily on athletics than others to drive enrollment. And those that lean the most heavily on athletics to drive enrollment are the ones that are the most overloaded. They have more sports, they have more student athletes. And what we've seen over the past few years is, as sports have been added and roster sizes have increased, that has not necessarily translated into additional support staff. So you've got sports information directors now that are handling 5, 6 more sports than they were 4 or 5 years ago with no additional resources. You've got athletic training staffs that are still the same size as they were, and then football gets added and 1 or 2 other sports get added, and all of a sudden you've got 200,000, you've got 200 more student athletes that you're trying to serve on your campus. So, that's the other challenge, is that we have, a fairly diverse membership in terms of how athletics is used to drive enrollment.
Well, and I think the other thing too is, when you look at trying to spread it out, there's only 2 options. You either spread it out or you reduce the number of games. And the majority of feedback from coaches was they didn't want to do that and we're happy with where we landed comparing to D2 and D3 from a recruiting standpoint. So.
And I think a couple of you have just kind of covered some of the questions coming in related specifically to soccer and volleyball about start dates and number of competitions, and that start date on the front end as well, potentially hindering some ability to have non-conference play. So both from get more competitions in, get more experience, as well as strength of schedule and rating. So we're seeing some questions come in related to that topic. And I think what you heard from Eric and Ashley is that this is a place where we're going to go back and do some further study. We appreciate your feedback and commentary on this. And I should have noted at the beginning, there is an opportunity on the webpage to continue to provide us feedback or comments or questions. So please do that. This is because of some of the things related to COVID and scheduling of prior conventions and that kind of thing. We're trying to use this as an opportunity to really bring this conversation and this study to the awareness of the membership in full, knowing that we've gone to coaches, leadership groups, and some of these other councils and things, but we're really trying to bring this conversation to everyone. And it truly is a conversation at this point. We're starting with some recommendations, but want additional feedback. So I think this is a good example of a place where, from what we've heard so far, we're going to go back and look further into it. I may ask one last question related to volleyball that has come in, which is that of those groups that were surveyed back in 2019, so presidents, athletics directors, FARs, and coaches, they were asked to kind of rank sports that cause problems and or cause concern, and in what specific types of ways. And volleyball was not coming up as one of the key, top 4 or 5 sports related to those concerns. So can we talk a little bit about why there were any or are any recommended changes for volleyball at this point in time, if that wasn't one of those top couple of sports of concern?
I think that there again, there's room for reconsideration on some of the recommendations that were made early on. I think if there was any schedule reduction recommended for volleyball, it was based on the date changes, or basically the start date being pushed back, right? And looking at the calendar and how many dates could you get in during that period of time. Obviously, if we move that start date forward, then that leaves more room in the schedule, and maybe the number of contests doesn't need to be addressed. So I think we looked at it from one of two ways. First of all, is it, do we need to adjust the number of contests? And then what does the calendar look like if you play that many contests? But then we also looked at it as, well, do we need to adjust the calendar? And then if we adjust the calendar, how many contests fit within that calendar limit? So I think volleyball is one of those sports that we looked at trying to adjust the calendar first, and then looking at what's realistic in terms of the number of contests that would fit within that calendar. So obviously, if we change the calendar, then that would cause us to go back and reconsider the contest limit question as well.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the pieces that I remember coming up in that conversation as well was that we heard from over 50% of our presidents, ADs, and FARs, I believe, all saying that housing and bringing student athletes back specifically in the fall was a significant burden on their institution. And you could look at that probably a number of ways, whether it's housing or facilitating the services that those student athletes need once they're on campus, or however you may look at that. But a majority of our institutions saying that that was a challenge that needed to be addressed. And so as you start to then apply that to the fall sports, one thing that we did talk through a little bit is applying some start dates or applying some limitations may need to be something that's kind of considered across the board, or at least to some extent, for various fall sports, knowing that nobody's going to jump up and down for it. But if we don't curb some of that start date in our fall sports, we continue to have these sizable challenges that our membership administrators are telling us need to be curbed in some way. So I may switch over to winter sports here. And one of the key sports that Winter looked at was basketball. So, I'll turn to you, Drew, as you were on the winter sport group and have worked with some of our basketball coaches groups on this, and talk a little bit about the thought process of reductions or game reductions in basketball. One of those questions being, we're just going through this change with basketball in a move to one division. So we haven't even seen that entirely play itself out yet. We're in its first season of moving towards a format change there. So Why did the study group look at basketball and say, we feel like we need some changes here?
Well, basketball is one of those sports that, I just talked a few minutes ago about coaches bringing their student athletes back and having them, start open gyms in August. We've also, as part of this process, surveyed conference commissioners, and we found that, there are a few, there are basketball contests that are happening in the first and second week of October. And so that was one of the reasons that we felt basketball was central to this discussion about overlapping seasons. And I would say, the questions out there about, the divisions aligning into in a unified NAI basketball, that really didn't come up. But now that the question's been asked, I think, everything else is adjusting right now. Schedules are adjusting. Schools are getting other schools on their schedule now that divisions are not an issue. So I don't really think the combination of divisions is relevant. Maybe Mike or Matt in a few minutes can contribute to that a little bit, but I don't think that's an issue. When we talked with the executive committees of the two coaches associations in basketball, the feedback was, very positive. I think we had a very good discussion, and our approach to it was to throw out some of the ideas we've had and let the coaches kind of chew on them a little bit and give us back what they really thought. And, when we talk about, condensing the schedule, I don't think the dates that we're to talk about the last weekend of October up to November 1st being the first contests, I don't think that's outrageous, and the coaches didn't think so either. When you talk about schedule reduction, it's really, I think, an issue that we really didn't talk about costs when we talked schedule reduction. It did come up in kind of an ancillary way because, we feel like in the next few years, the presidents may look at contest limits as low-hanging fruit for saving overall costs. And, one of the points that came up with the executive committees was, why not use this opportunity to get ahead of this a little bit and to kind of define it ourselves. And so the coaches came up with this, and we threw out 28. The men's executive committee actually threw out 27. But the question that's on the table, and there's talk of shrinking basketball from 30 to 27, is taking away opportunities from student athletes the goal? The answer is no. And really the idea that the coaches had, which Mike and I and Matt felt was a really good idea, was that we don't reduce. Right now it's 30 games plus 2 additional opportunities in the way of an exhibition or scrimmage. What the coaches propose is that it's either 27 or 28 games with 4 additional opportunities for scrimmages and exhibitions. And here's why. Those scrimmages and exhibitions either exhibitions make you money or scrimmages don't cost you money because they're typically local. And so instead of taking away the opportunities, we're actually, I think, keeping them the same, but reducing the countable contests. I think another kind of elephant in the room with this topic is the Raiders. How many times across sports have you heard the contest limits 30 games? This team only played 27. So we're gonna penalize them in the process, and they're not going to have an equal opportunity for a national tournament at large bid because they didn't play enough games. And the coaches really liked that thought that if we drop it to 27 or 28, there's not a lot of schools minus COVID that can't take an honest shot at 27 games and make it. And I would say the same thing. Spring's coming up. The same question in baseball a little bit is, I'll use Southeastern. When we get to the ratings process, my coach is going out and finding games, and we've got to get to Edward Waters on a weekday, or just to be able to get our 55 games in because we don't want to be penalized by the Raiders. And so that's kind of an issue that's come up throughout the years where Raiders have started to penalize schools for not playing enough games. And so we think that, say, if it's a 27 game countable game limit, giving it 31 opportunities So you get 4 additional opportunities for scrimmages or exhibitions. It does not take away opportunities from student athletes, reduces costs, and then also kind of brings that rating expectation into line where it's a reasonable number for people to meet. Because geographically, there's certain areas of the country you can get 30 basketball games. You could get 40 if you wanted them, but there's other areas of the country, kind of the outliers, that you have to really work hard to get 30 games, and in some cases you've got to pay a significant amount of guarantee money to get those opportunities. So, anything to add, Mike, Matt?
I'll add from a rating standpoint, and probably Darin can, because he's been on the selection committee for baseball, and that's where it all started. That the move away from ratings to selection committees, which is happening this year, really changes that thinking, and coaches have to start thinking differently when it comes to that. I've been on 3 different selection committees as this has gotten started: soccer, baseball, tennis. And each one of those groups, from coaches and administrators, talk about quality and not quantity. So it kind of backs up what Drew's saying of, like, it's not about the number you're playing, it's about who you're playing. Now, that does affect when we're trying to do these non-conference games, because you want to get quality opponents for the selection committee to view. There's no question about that. And this would make it a little bit difficult to do that in some areas, in some sports. Not all sports, not basketball, but a sport like maybe soccer and volleyball for sure. But it's not quantity. It's not that number. It is quality of opponents that you're playing, what your schedule looks like. That's what selection committees have looked at and will look at for those that haven't experienced it yet.
And one thing I might add to piggyback on that, Mike, is I know something that was talked about within the study group is the recognition that whatever the final draft recommendations may look like, any of this is going to mean that we're all going to have to adjust in some manner, whether that's at the campus level or at the conference level as well, as you think about your current conference scheduling. So, and as you start to think about raters and getting in non-conference competitions and the value and what is the strategy beyond that, that also becomes a conference conversation as well about whatever the regulations at the national level may end up looking like or how they're adjusted. We should all sort of be prepared that we may have to think about, do we need to adjust our campus or conference operations strategically kind of around those to position us the best.
And Chesney, I think Drew and Mike covered basketball really well. I would just add a comment about wrestling, health and safety, the nature of the sport, and that was a driving factor in the recommendation, especially when they start and the total number of contests. So it was consistent feedback received, and especially the future direction of possibly wrestling is that health and safety component, cutting weight for a very long season. So I just wanted to mention wrestling as well under the winter sports.
Yes, thank you, Matt. And the wrestling recommendations currently show for a slight reduction in number of dates available, as well as shortening or creating a start date that would be a little bit shorter than what we see at least typically happening. Knowing that every school is a little bit different and there's not exactly one standard right now, but what we generally see in common practice, shortening up that practice or kind of start date type of a window for wrestling. Thank you all for everybody who is submitting questions. And I do want to say, as we're kind of winding down towards the end of our hour, we'll continue on here with a few more, but anything that you do submit, we will certainly be sharing that with the full study group, whether it's something that you're submitting right now on the chat, or again, on the webpage, you can submit questions, comments, thoughts, any of those things as well. So Reagan and Darin, I know we've talked a bit about baseball and softball, but we certainly have received lots of questions related to those two sports in particular. And I think a lot of them center around the general idea that in both baseball and softball, currently the study group is recommending a reduction in number of overall competitions that could be played. And I think part of the reason that that's being recommended relates to just the data that we're looking at is showing us that most of our teams aren't actually able to play a complete schedule. But part of the comments and the questions that are coming back is, why do we need to actually reduce the overall number of competitions that a team could play? Why can't we give them the opportunity to try and play that many? And if they're not able to because of weather or because of whatever else, then they're just not able to. But why is a regulation around that necessary?
Well, I think it starts with what our charge is with schedule creep. And so again, when you look at basketball and the overlap that we have from January to early February, that's kind of where we started with that. Certainly baseball coaches, and I'll let Reagan talk to about softball, but certainly baseball coaches would try to play 100 games in 60 days if they could. Baseball coaches don't want to reduce games, right? We know that. And so for years, I mean, going back almost 20 years now in this, we went from, 65 games to talk of going down to 45 games to 40 games to 55. Where's the number? And so as we looked at the data, as you mentioned, that came in, one of the easiest, lowest hanging fruit was that already across the country, we're not playing 55 baseball games. It's just not happening. And we saw a little bit of that creep too, primarily from probably the South, Southeast, and then maybe out in California where it's warm, where teams are even playing earlier and earlier back into January. And so again, when you're putting more and more pressure on your administrative staffs, and for the same question that Eric and Mike had mentioned earlier about even football teams coming back earlier, now we're getting questions across the country of baseball teams trying to come back earlier. And again, it's an additional cost. So that's kind of where we started. One of the things that was very important to us, and especially in the spring, was that we looked hard at Division II and made sure that we didn't go below that 50 game threshold. We didn't want to get down below that and make it look Division III light. And we also, there was one of the comments that came in about, why don't we look more at Division I? Well, we're not a Power 5 Division I conference, and so, or organization. And so the same thing holds true when you look at the end of the year, because we're compressed as well when it comes to the World Series, where contracts are in place. The longer we let institutions keep players toward the end of the year, that's more and more cost. And so we're trying to balance all of that and still be able to play a 50 game schedule, which I think is more than fair. The other thing we didn't do, and we were very intentional in this too, is we didn't touch the fall. We wanted to make sure that if teams wanted to play those games in the fall and conferences wanted to have conference games in the fall, or conferences just wanted to have regular games in the fall, that institutions could do that. And so you could spread those out if you so chose. And so that's kind of was the overarching theme. I met with both the baseball executive committee and then met with the baseball executive committee heavy, if you will. There were additions to that after that. And so we've talked at length with about some of these things and topics. And then we've also talked about some other potential recommendations that they've had. I came back with our group yesterday and we had an additional conversation. So we'll continue to massage this, and as additional questions come in, we'll certainly take those each one and fully consider them. So Reagan, I'll let you talk about softball.
Yeah, thanks, Darin. I think we had, kind of that same conversation. Matt Beaudry and I met with the softball execs, and I think one of the important things, and Drew talked to this earlier, is the autonomy within the institutions and within the conferences. And as you just mentioned, Darin, about what fall can look like in addition to spring. And really making sure that we didn't touch the fall and allowing, I know Corey's on the call and they get some spring or some fall games in within their conference. And so I think it's important to look at that. But again, consistency as we're looking at all the other sports, starting with start dates and with game reduction for the same reasons you're talking about. And I'll say from a northern state that we are playing baseball and softball in January and February. So it's not just in the South. But for the same reasons we've talked about across the board, it's the staffing, it's the student athletes, it's bringing them back earlier and earlier into that spring term, and what that's costing institutions. So just consistency, I guess I would say.
One last final follow-up for you two on that same conversation is, some were noting that in baseball and softball, you see so much pressure happen at the end of the regular season because the weather is better, to make up those games, get those final competitions or conference makeups in, but it also then applies at a time which tends to be heavy stress from an academic side at the end of the class schedule or right around finals or whenever that may be. So some asking, is one way to address that, or were there creative solutions considered, and is one way to address that not just trying to cram it all in, especially if we're sort of delaying the start date, but to lengthen it a bit further and even kind of delay the championship or push further into June so that we all have a little bit more time to work back from.
Well, we've had that discussion. Henry, I'll let you, but we've had that discussion. Certainly cost is a huge implication, right? And on the baseball side, Lewiston's a great place to host. It is on typically it's on, Memorial Day weekend. So there's been discussion about that as well. There's contracts in place. There's a lot of things you've got to consider there. For me personally, and when we look at it from a committee standpoint, just the cost of extending the stay of those teams is exorbitant. Now, you say, well, there's only, it only affects a handful of teams each year, but it affects a handful of teams each year. And the more you push back conference tournaments, the more you push back opening rounds, the more it affects more and more teams across the country. The other thing, and as you folks on the call have said in the room, as Mike alluded to, I've been on baseball and softballs, or baseball and tennis as well, looking at the National Oversight Committee or going to the tournament. And the one premise that keeps coming up over and over and over again, yeah, you want the best teams there, but it's also cost. How can you get them there? How can you fly them there? What is that? And there's times in that room where you make an adjustment at the end purely based on cost. And so now if you're talking about even extending that more, you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of more dollars. It's just really tough right now. So. Reagan?
Yeah, I would agree, Darin. It comes back to the original charge of the group from the COP is looking at finances. And when you look at what we talk about with that fall group and bringing student athletes in earlier and earlier, the same principle has to apply as extending your year with those student athletes as some institutions are finishing, at the end of April or even early May. And we're extending it out a month and a half later. I just don't think it's financially responsible of us to do that as we're trying to control that.
I want to clarify something so that we don't get beat up as an association later. I'll clean up Darin a little bit. The selection of teams is not what's considered by cost. The selection is purely by the committee and their record and resume. The cost dictates who you play once you've been selected. So I don't want someone to call me and say, I didn't get in because it cost too much to travel me. No, that's not it at all. It's how you're seated. And I can see some of you on that thinking this. So I'm just going to put a quash to that right now.
Well, and purely again, the final site too, when you start looking at flights and such. So yeah, thanks, Mike.
Well, as you can all see from the course of this conversation, there is a lot to consider. There are a lot of sides to every question. And there's a lot of factors as we looked at those 5 or 6 guiding principles at the beginning. There are a lot of factors to take into account on every one of these types of questions. So it's a very big conversation. I want to reiterate that on behalf of the study group, we're very much looking for feedback and input and thoughts and guidance, or if you think we're on the wrong track or the right track or wrong track, we're looking for that feedback as we continue to move forward with this study. So we've still got some time to continue to take in that feedback and kind of dig in deeper and further. So we appreciate you all joining us here today. And please know that you can get in touch with us through the webpage and share any additional thoughts and conversations. We'll also, this Zoom is being recorded, so we'll also have this available to share online for anybody who missed it, or if you want to go back and review what we discussed here today. So thank you all so much for your time today. More to come on this in the coming weeks, and hope everybody continues to hang in there and stay healthy and safe.